Les Misérables is more than just a classic novel. It is an epic masterpiece that explores the depths of human suffering, the power of redemption, and the eternal struggle for justice. Written by Victor Hugo and published in 1862, this monumental work shocked and moved readers around the world with its passionate defense of the poor and oppressed. It is a story about one man's journey from darkness to light, but it is also a sweeping portrait of French society during one of the most turbulent periods in history. Today, Les Misérables stands as one of the greatest novels ever written, a work that continues to inspire readers with its message of love, compassion, and the triumph of the human spirit over injustice and despair. To understand Les Misérables, we must first understand its creator, Victor Hugo. Born in 1802 in Besançon, France, Hugo lived through some of the most dramatic events in French history. He witnessed the fall of Napoleon, the restoration of the monarchy, multiple revolutions, and the rise of the Second Empire. These tumultuous times shaped his political views and his writing. Hugo began his career as a poet and playwright, achieving fame at a young age. By his 20s, he was already considered one of France's leading literary figures. However, his life was marked by both triumph and tragedy. He experienced the loss of his beloved daughter Leopoldine, who drowned in 1843, a tragedy that haunted him for the rest of his life. This personal grief deepened his empathy for human suffering and influenced his later works, including Les Misérables. Victor Hugo was not just a writer, but also a passionate political activist. He began his career as a royalist, but gradually moved toward liberal and republican views. He became an outspoken advocate for social justice, the abolition of the death penalty, universal education, and the rights of the poor. In 1851, when Louis Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in a coup and declared himself Emperor Napoleon III, Hugo publicly opposed him. This act of defiance forced Hugo into exile, and he spent nearly 20 years living in the Channel Islands, first in Jersey and then in Guernsey. It was during this exile that Hugo wrote Les Misérables. The novel took him 12 years to complete, and it became his way of speaking out against injustice and inequality. Hugo poured his political convictions, his compassion for the suffering, and his hope for a better world into every page of this massive work. Les Misérables was published in 1862 and became an immediate sensation across Europe and beyond. The novel was translated into multiple languages almost instantly, and people lined up outside bookstores to purchase copies. In Brussels, where it was first published, the book sold out within hours. Readers were captivated by the story of Jean Valjean and moved by Hugo's passionate plea for social justice. However, the novel also faced criticism. Some critics found it too sentimental, too political, and too long. Hugo's lengthy digressions on topics like the Battle of Waterloo, the Paris sewers, and the history of monasteries frustrated some readers who wanted to focus on the main story. Religious conservatives criticized Hugo's attacks on the church, while political conservatives objected to his sympathetic portrayal of revolutionaries. Despite these criticisms, or perhaps because of them, Les Misérables became one of the most widely read novels of the 19th century and has never been out of print since its publication. The story of Les Misérables takes place in France during the early 19th century, primarily between 1815 and 1832. This was a period of immense social and political upheaval. The novel opens in 1815, just after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo during the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. French society was deeply divided between royalists who supported the old aristocratic order and republicans who dreamed of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The majority of the population lived in desperate poverty, while a small elite controlled most of the wealth. The poor had no political rights, little access to education, and almost no hope of improving their circumstances. This is the world into which Hugo places his characters, and it is a world crying out for change. At the heart of Les Misérables is Jean Valjean, one of the most memorable characters in all of literature. Valjean's story begins in profound misery. As a young man, he steals a loaf of bread to feed his starving sister and her children. For this minor crime, he is sentenced to 5 years of hard labor in the galleys. When he tries to escape, his sentence is extended again and again until he serves 19 years for stealing bread. When Valjean is finally released, he carries a yellow passport that marks him as an ex-convict. This passport ensures that no one will hire him, no innkeeper will give him a room, and society treats him as an outcast. Hardened by years of brutal treatment and rejected by everyone he meets, Valjean has become bitter and filled with hatred for society. He no longer believes in goodness or human compassion. This is the broken man who arrives at the door of Bishop Myriel in the town of Digne. The encounter between Jean Valjean and Bishop Myriel is the turning point not just of the novel, but of Valjean's entire life. Bishop Myriel, known as Monseigneur Bienvenu, or Welcome, is a man of true Christian charity who lives simply and gives everything he has to the poor. When Valjean arrives at his door, desperate and angry, the bishop welcomes him without hesitation. He offers Valjean food, a bed, and most importantly, human dignity and respect. He treats Valjean not as a criminal, but as a brother. However, Valjean's years of suffering have corrupted him. In the middle of the night, he steals the bishop's silver and flees. When the police catch him and bring him back, everyone expects the bishop to condemn him and send him back to prison. Instead, Bishop Myriel tells the police that he gave Valjean the silver as a gift. More than that, he adds the silver candlesticks and tells Valjean that he has bought his soul for God and must now become an honest man. This act of extraordinary mercy and forgiveness shakes Valjean to his core. For the first time in decades, someone has shown him kindness and believed in his capacity for goodness. This moment of grace transforms Valjean and sets him on a path of redemption that will define the rest of his life. Jean Valjean takes the bishop's lesson to heart and dedicates himself to becoming a better man. He breaks his parole and creates a new identity as Monsieur Madeleine. Through hard work and innovation in manufacturing, he becomes wealthy and uses his money to help others. He establishes factories that provide employment, builds schools and hospitals, and becomes so beloved that he is elected mayor of the town of Montreuil-sur-Mer. Under his leadership, the town prospers and poverty decreases. Valjean has truly transformed himself from a bitter ex-convict into a man of compassion and generosity. However, his past is not so easily escaped. Inspector Javert, a police officer who was a guard when Valjean was in the galleys, arrives in town and begins to suspect that the respectable Mère Madeleine is actually the escaped convict Jean Valjean. This sets up one of the great moral conflicts in literature, the confrontation between Valjean, who represents mercy and redemption, and Javert, who represents rigid law and justice without compassion. Inspector Javert is one of the most fascinating and complex antagonists in literature. He is not evil in any conventional sense. In fact, Javert is honest, incorruptible, and completely dedicated to his duty. He never takes bribes, never abuses his power for personal gain, and genuinely believes he is serving justice. However, Javert's worldview is rigid and absolute. He believes that society is divided into two classes: the good people who obey the law and the criminals who break it. Once someone has committed a crime, they are forever marked as criminal in Javert's eyes. The idea that a criminal could reform and become good is impossible for him to accept because it would undermine his entire understanding of the world. Javert sees law and order as sacred, more important than individual circumstances or human compassion. To Javert, Jean Valjean breaking his parole is not a man trying to build a new life, but a criminal defying lawful authority. Javert pursues Valjean with single-minded determination for decades, never questioning whether his pursuit serves justice or merely satisfies his own need for moral certainty. The relationship between Valjean and Javert forms the philosophical core of Les Misérables. They represent two opposing views of justice. Javert believes in the letter of the law, in punishment without mercy, and in a rigid moral order that cannot bend. Valjean represents mercy, redemption, and the belief that people can change. Hugo uses these two characters to ask fundamental questions. Is the law always just? Can strict adherence to rules lead to injustice? Should we judge people by their worst moments or by their capacity for growth? Is redemption possible, and if so, who deserves it? These questions are not abstract philosophical debates in the novel, but life-and-death issues that determine the fates of the characters. Fantine is one of the most heartbreaking characters in Les Misérables, and her story exposes the brutal treatment of women and the poor in 19th century France. Fantine is a young, beautiful, and naive woman who falls in love with a student named Thalamus. She believes he loves her and will marry her, but after she becomes pregnant, Thalamus abandons her as a joke, leaving her alone with a baby daughter named Cosette. Unable to find work with an illegitimate child, Fantine is forced to leave Cosette with innkeepers named the Thénardiers while she goes to work in Montreuil-sur-Mer. The Thénardiers are cruel and exploitative. They lie to Fantine, telling her that Cosette needs expensive treatments and demanding more and more money. Desperate to provide for her daughter, Fantine sacrifices everything. She sells her hair, then her front teeth, and finally her body, becoming a prostitute. Society shows Fantine no mercy. She is exploited, degraded, and discarded. When she becomes ill and is dying, she has only one hope: to see her daughter one more time. Fantine's suffering moves Valjean deeply. When he learns her story and realizes that she has been dismissed from his factory because of moral judgments about her illegitimate child, he is filled with guilt. He promises the dying Fantine that he will rescue Cosette and raise her as his own daughter. This promise becomes Valjean's sacred mission. However, before he can fulfill it, his past catches up with him. Javert has arrested another man, believing him to be Jean Valjean, and this innocent man is about to be sent back to the galleys for life. Valjean faces an agonizing moral choice. He can remain silent, let the innocent man be condemned, and continue his good work as mayor, helping hundreds of people. Or he can reveal his identity, save the innocent man, but destroy everything he has built, and likely never be able to rescue Cosette. In one of the novel's most powerful scenes, Valjean struggles with this decision through a long night of spiritual torment. In the end, his conscience will not allow him to let an innocent man suffer. He goes to court and reveals his true identity, choosing to sacrifice himself rather than allow injustice to occur. This decision demonstrates that Valjean has truly internalized the bishop's lesson. He has become a man who values moral integrity above personal safety or practical considerations. After revealing his identity, Valjean is arrested and sentenced back to the galleys, but he escapes once again to fulfill his promise to Fantine. He rescues young Cosette from the abusive Thénardiers on Christmas Eve, one of the most moving scenes in the novel. Cosette has been treated as a slave, forced to work constantly, given rags to wear, and shown no love or affection. When Valjean appears and offers to take her away, it is like a miracle for the child. He buys her a beautiful doll, the first toy she has ever owned, and for the first time in her life, someone treats her with kindness and love. Valjean and Cosette flee to Paris, where they hide in the poorest neighborhoods. Despite being hunted by Javert and living in constant danger, this becomes the happiest period of Valjean's life. He has someone to love and protect, a purpose beyond survival. Cosette gives Valjean's life meaning, and he gives her the childhood she was denied. Their relationship is one of the most beautiful in literature, a bond formed not by blood but by love, sacrifice, and mutual salvation. As Cosette grows into a young woman, Hugo shifts his focus to introduce new characters and explore different aspects of French society. We meet a group of idealistic young revolutionaries led by Enjolras, a passionate believer in republican ideals and social justice. These students represent the hope for France's future and Hugo's own political beliefs. They dream of overthrowing the monarchy and establishing a republic based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. Among this group is Marius Pontmercy, a young man from an aristocratic family who has embraced democratic ideals much to his family's horror. Marius is earnest, idealistic, and somewhat naive. He lives in poverty, having been disinherited by his royalist grandfather, and survives by doing translation work. Marius becomes the romantic lead of the novel when he falls passionately in love with Cosette. The romance between Marius and Cosette is both beautiful and frustrating. They see each other in the Luxembourg Gardens and fall in love at first sight, but neither has the courage to speak to the other for months. They exchange glances and secret smiles, building an entire relationship in their imaginations before exchanging a single word. When they finally meet and declare their love, it is with the intensity and innocence of first love. However, their romance creates a painful conflict for Valjean. Cosette has been his entire world. His reason for living, and the thought of losing her to another man fills him with anguish. At the same time, he loves Cosette too much to deny her happiness. Valjean's struggle with his feelings about Marius shows Hugo's psychological insight. Valjean is not portrayed as a perfect saint, but as a real human being who experiences jealousy, possessiveness, and fear of abandonment, even while trying to do the right thing. The Thénardiers return as a dark counterpoint to Jean Valjean's goodness. If Valjean represents redemption and the possibility of moral transformation, the Thénardiers represent those who choose to remain in moral darkness. Monsieur and Madame Thénardier are con artists, thieves, and abusers who exploit everyone around them, including their own children. They abused Cosette when she was in their care, and they mistreat their own daughter Ponine even more cruelly. The Thénardiers have no redeeming qualities. They are petty, cruel, greedy, and cowardly. In Paris, they lead a gang of criminals and survive through various schemes and crimes. Hugo uses the Thénardiers to show that not everyone chooses redemption even when given opportunities. Unlike Valjean, who was driven to crime by desperation and then chose to change, the Thénardiers embrace criminality and never show remorse or desire to reform. Ponine Thénardier is one of the most tragic figures in Les Misérables. As a child, she was spoiled by her parents while they abused Cosette. But after her family's fall from respectability, Ponine becomes a victim of her parents' cruelty and neglect. She lives in poverty and degradation, often involved in her parents' criminal schemes. Despite her harsh life, Ponine retains a capacity for love and self-sacrifice. She is hopelessly in love with Marius, but he only has eyes for Cosette. Ponine's love for Marius is pure and selfless. She helps him find Cosette even though it breaks her heart, and she ultimately sacrifices her life to protect him. Ponine represents the wasted potential of those born into circumstances that give them little chance for happiness or fulfillment. Hugo shows us that she could have been good and happy if given the opportunity, but society and her family destroyed her chances. Her death scene, where she dies in Marius's arms after being shot, is one of the most emotionally powerful moments in the novel. The political and social tensions that have been building throughout the novel finally explode in the June Rebellion of 1832. This historical uprising was triggered by the death of General Lamarque, a popular military leader who supported Republican causes. The people of Paris, frustrated by poverty, inequality, and political oppression, rise up against the monarchy. Enjolras and his friends see this as the moment they have been waiting for, a chance to overthrow tyranny and establish a republic. They build a barricade in the streets of Paris and prepare to fight for their ideals. The barricade scenes are among the most famous in literature, filled with speeches about freedom, dramatic confrontations, and heroic sacrifices. Marius joins the rebellion, partly from genuine idealism, but also because he believes Cosette has been taken away from him and he has nothing left to live for. The barricade scenes showcase Hugo's ability to write both intimate character moments and sweeping historical drama. We see individual acts of courage and sacrifice set against the larger tragedy of a field revolution. Enjolras emerges as a noble figure, pure in his dedication to liberty and willing to die for his beliefs. Gavroche, a young street urchin and one of the Thénardier's abandoned children, becomes a symbol of the courage and spirit of Paris's poor. He fearlessly mocks the soldiers and collects ammunition from the bodies of the fallen until he is killed, dying while singing a revolutionary song. His death is heartbreaking because of his youth and innocent bravery. Hugo uses these characters to honor the ordinary people who fight and die for ideals larger than themselves, even in causes that are doomed to fail. Jean Valjean arrives at the barricade for his own reasons. Learning that Marius is there, he comes to protect the young man for Cosette's sake, even though Marius is his rival for her love. This selfless act demonstrates how completely Valjean has transformed from the bitter man who stole the bishop's silver. At the barricade, Valjean is given the job of executing a captured spy. That spy turns out to be Javert. In this moment, Valjean has the power to kill the man who has hunted him for decades, and no one would blame him. The revolutionaries expect him to execute Javert as a traitor to the people. Instead, Valjean leads Javert away and sets him free. This act of mercy toward his greatest enemy represents the highest point of Valjean's moral journey. He has learned to respond to hatred with love, to cruelty with mercy, and to revenge with forgiveness. Hugo suggests that this is the true revolution, not the one fought with guns at the barricade, but the revolution of the human heart. When the barricade falls and the revolutionaries are killed, Valjean saves Marius by carrying his unconscious body through the sewers of Paris. This journey through the sewers is one of the most memorable sequences in the novel, both literally and symbolically. Valjean wades through filth and darkness, carrying the weight of the young man who represents his greatest fear, the loss of Cosette. The physical journey through the sewers mirrors Valjean's lifelong, spiritual journey from darkness toward light. When they finally emerge, Javert is waiting, and Valjean expects to be arrested. However, Javert has been profoundly shaken by Valjean's mercy at the barricade. For the first time in his life, Javert's absolute certainty has been challenged. He has been shown mercy by a criminal, and he doesn't know how to reconcile this with his worldview. Javert lets Valjean go, but this act of mercy destroys him. Unable to live with the contradiction between his rigid beliefs and the reality of Valjean's goodness, Javert throws himself into the Seine and drowns. His suicide is tragic because it shows the danger of inflexible thinking and the inability to accept moral complexity. Javert is a victim of his own rigidity, unable to grow or change as Valjean has. The final section of Les Misérables deals with the aftermath of these dramatic events. Marius recovers from his wounds and marries Cosette, but this happy ending is complicated by Valjean's moral struggle. He knows that Marius and Cosette deserve happiness, but he also feels he must be honest about his past as a convict. Despite having completely transformed himself and lived a moral life for decades, Valjean cannot escape the belief that his past makes him unworthy. He tells Marius about his criminal history, expecting and even seeking rejection. Marius, influenced by class prejudice and his own limited understanding, reacts exactly as Valjean feared. He is horrified to learn that his father-in-law is an ex-convict and begins to distance Cosette from Valjean. Marius allows Valjean to visit but treats him coldly and tries to end the relationship between Cosette and her adoptive father. This rejection, even though it comes from understandable if misguided motives, breaks Valjean's heart and begins his final decline. The cruel irony of Valjean's situation is that he has spent his entire life trying to become worthy, to redeem himself through good works and moral living, yet he still cannot escape the stigma of his past. Society's judgment, internalized even by the good-hearted Marius, condemns Valjean to isolation and suffering despite his transformation. Only when the Thénardiers attempt to blackmail Marius and accidentally reveal that Valjean was the mysterious savior who rescued Marius from the barricade does the truth become clear. Marius realizes that he has misjudged Valjean terribly, and that the man he pushed away is actually a hero who sacrificed everything for others. Marius and Cosette rush to Valjean's bedside, where they find him dying. In the final scenes of the novel, Valjean experiences a moment of complete peace and happiness. Cosette and Marius tell him they love him and want him in their lives. Valjean dies knowing he is loved and forgiven, his soul finally at rest. Hugo gives Valjean the redemption and peace he sought throughout his life, suggesting that love and compassion ultimately triumph over judgment and condemnation. The themes of Les Misérables are as relevant today as they were in 1862. At its core, the novel is about redemption and the possibility of moral transformation. Jean Valjean's journey from criminal to saint demonstrates Hugo's belief that people can change, that past mistakes do not have to define our future, and that everyone deserves a second chance. This theme challenges the tendency to permanently label and condemn people based on their worst actions. Hugo asks us to see people as complex beings capable of growth rather than reducing them to their crimes or failures. The novel also explores the tension between justice and mercy. Through the conflict between Valjean and Javert, Hugo shows that strict adherence to law without compassion can itself become a form of injustice. True justice must include mercy and recognize individual circumstances. The social critique in Les Misérables is devastating and comprehensive. Hugo exposes how poverty, inequality, and lack of education trap people in cycles of desperation and crime. Fantine's story shows how society punishes women who fall outside narrow moral boundaries while offering them no support or path to redemption. The children in the novel, especially Cosette and Gavroche, demonstrate how poverty robs children of their innocence and potential. Hugo argues passionately that society has a moral obligation to provide for the poor, educate all children, and create conditions where everyone has a chance at a decent life. He shows that many crimes are driven by desperation rather than evil, and that addressing the root causes of poverty would do more to reduce crime than harsh punishment. These arguments remain relevant in contemporary debates about criminal justice reform, social welfare, and economic inequality. The theme of love runs throughout Les Misérables in various forms. There is romantic love between Marius and Cosette, parental love between Valjean and Cosette, selfless love in Ponine's sacrifice, and Christian love in the bishop's mercy. Hugo suggests that love is the force that redeems individuals and has the power to transform society. The bishop's act of love saves Valjean's soul, and Valjean's love for Cosette gives him purpose and motivation to continue his moral journey. Even Javert, the character most opposed to forgiveness, is ultimately undone by an unexpected act of love. Hugo argues that love, compassion, and mercy are not signs of weakness, but expressions of the highest human values. In a world marked by cruelty, injustice, and suffering, love becomes a revolutionary act. Hugo's writing style in Les Misérables is grand, passionate, and deliberately digressive. The novel is enormous, over 1,500 pages in most editions, and Hugo interrupts the main narrative with lengthy essays on topics ranging from the Battle of Waterloo to the history of Parisian slang to detailed descriptions of the city's sewer system. Some readers find these digressions frustrating, but they serve important purposes. They provide historical and social context that helps us understand the world of the characters. They demonstrate Hugo's vast knowledge and his desire to educate his readers about social issues. Most importantly, they reinforce the novel's themes by showing how individual stories connect to larger historical and social forces. Hugo wants readers to understand that the suffering of characters like Fantine and Jean Valjean is not just individual bad luck, but the result of systemic injustice that must be addressed. The influence of Les Misérables on literature and popular culture is immeasurable. The novel has been continuously in print since 1862 and has been translated into virtually every written language. It has been adapted countless times for stage, film, and television, most famously as the hugely successful musical that has been performed around the world since 1985. The musical has introduced millions of people to Hugo's story and themes, even if in a condensed form. Characters from the novel, especially Jean Valjean and Javert, have become archetypes. Valjean represents the possibility of redemption and the power of compassion, while Javert represents rigid adherence to law without mercy. The novel's themes of social justice have inspired activists and reformers for over a century and a half. Hugo's passionate advocacy for the poor and oppressed has made Les Misérables a touchstone for progressive social movements worldwide. The title, Les Misérables, literally means the miserable ones, or the wretched, and it refers to all the suffering people whose stories Hugo tells. But the title also contains a challenge and a hope. Hugo is asking us to see and acknowledge the miserable, to recognize their humanity, and to work toward a society where such misery is no longer necessary. The novel suggests that misery is not inevitable, but is created by human systems of injustice that can be changed. Throughout the novel, characters have moments where they must choose between self-interest and compassion, between following rules and doing what is right, between judgment and mercy. These choices determine not just individual fates, but the moral character of society as a whole. In conclusion, Les Misérables is a novel that demands we expand our capacity for compassion and work toward a more just society. Victor Hugo created a sweeping epic that combines intimate personal drama with grand historical events, romantic love with political revolution, and harsh realism with spiritual transcendence. The novel's enormous scope allows Hugo to explore every aspect of French society and to show how individual choices ripple out to affect countless others. Jean Valjean's transformation from bitter criminal to moral exemplar demonstrates that redemption is possible, but it also shows how difficult that transformation is and how little support society offers to those trying to change. The contrast between Valjean and Javert reminds us that rigid thinking and inability to see moral complexity can lead to tragedy. The suffering of characters like Fantine, Ponine, and Gavroche exposes the brutal cost of social injustice and demands that we do better. Les Misérables challenges us to examine our own beliefs about crime and punishment, justice and mercy, and our obligations to one another. Hugo asks whether we judge people by their worst moments or by their capacity for growth, whether we show mercy to those who have fallen or condemn them forever, and whether we work to create a society that lifts up the poor or one that abandons them to misery. These are not easy questions, and Hugo does not offer simple answers, but he makes clear where his sympathies lie. The novel is a passionate argument for compassion, for seeing the humanity in everyone, and for building a society based on love and justice rather than on privilege and punishment. More than 150 years after its publication, Les Misérables continues to move readers and inspire people to fight for a better world. If you found this exploration of Les Misérables meaningful, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into classic literature. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Jean Valjean's journey and the themes of redemption and social justice. Do you think society today has learned the lessons Hugo tried to teach, or are we still creating unnecessary misery? How can we balance justice with mercy in our own lives? These questions matter as much today as they did in 1862. Thank you for listening. And until next time, keep exploring the great works that challenge us to be better and to build a more just and compassionate world.